My name is Stephanie Vale, 34 years old. The chandelier over the fellowship hall threw cold sparks across linen and glass when my father's voice cut through the saxophone like a box cutter through cardboard. She's just a gate guard. Who even invited her? Chairs grated. Laughter came quick and eager, the kind people share when they want to be seen on the right side of a joke. No hand reached for mine. I breathed through my nose the way instructors taught us. 4 counts in, 4 out, making the world small enough to hold without spilling. The groom's father rose from the head table. He wasn't a large man, but the air recalibrated to him as if someone had adjusted a level. His suit sat clean on his frame. His shoes remembered polish. He did not look left or right for permission. He set his glass down so the stem didn't rattle, stepped forward with that unhurried accuracy I recognize in professionals, and lifted his right hand. The salute snapped up, edge crisp, wrist straight, and the room's noise folded itself shut. A fork fell. The sound landed like a period. "Sir," he said, voice low enough that it traveled, "with respect, she outranks every one of us here." The sentence unlocked something that had rusted shut. A few guests blinked. A child stopped spinning. A cousin's mouth stayed open around a laugh that didn't arrive. My father blinked too, the way he does when a tractor stalls for no good reason. He tried to grin and found his teeth wouldn't cooperate. "Outranks," he repeated, cheapening the word. She worked the county fair with a clipboard. The groom's father held the salute a heartbeat longer, long enough for the room to feel what a standard is, and then let his arm fall with dignity rather than drama. He didn't look at the mayor. He didn't borrow authority. He simply turned toward me with the steadiness of a man confirming coordinates. "Ma'am," he said. I inclined my head, respect exchanged, not displayed. The DJ froze mid-gesture. A bottle hovered over a flute. The bride, Lacey, my sister, watched me from near the cake, the smallest rope of eye contact thrown across 30 feet of discomfort. She had once pressed a blanket over my shoulders in a cold hallway and told me I would warm again. The memory surfaced like a flare. I almost let it sink. My father swayed as if stepping off a curb he couldn't see. He reached for a chair that had skidded back in the commotion, misjudged the distance, and sat hard. Then, as a hush took on weight, he slid toward the floor. Someone whispered, "Call 911," but Lacey was already there, fingers on his neck, doing what she always did best, think with her hands. "He's breathing," she announced, calm as a medic. "Paper fan. Juice, please." The cousin who is usually unhelpful produced sugar packets with the solemnity of sacrament. Someone opened a side door, and an honest ribbon of night air cut through wilted perfume and humiliation. I didn't rush. In rooms like this, panic multiplies faster than help. The groom crouched beside his father, then glanced up at me with a look that asked nothing and offered steadiness. I gave the smallest nod. "Yes, hold the perimeter of decency." "All right, folks," he said to the guests, voice pitched to soothe without shrinking. "We're fine. Take a breath, grab water, and remember why we're here." He didn't say love. He said steadiness, and people heard it. My father's color went thin. He stared at his hands as though they were misfiled. My mother stood behind him, her thumb moving in small circles on his shoulder, motions that had comforted colds and heartbreaks, and now this newer, harsher thing, a public reckoning. He tried to find my name and couldn't get past the first consonant. He closed his mouth, opened it again, and chose silence. For him, that restraint was a kind of salute. The groom's father, Mark, someone whispered, turned back to the crowd. He didn't raise his voice. "You're confusing a post with a person," he said, "and a joke with judgment." His eyes swept the room without accusation. "A gate is where a community keeps its promise to itself. Someone here keeps that promise while you sleep." He let the sentence sit, unadorned. Chairs stilled. People shifted as if their spines remembered how to stand. I could feel the small machinery I live by whirring. Exits. 17 steps. Kitchen door. 9. Fire extinguisher behind the photo booth curtain. Defibrillator behind the credenza across from the coat rack. I've measured distance for years. Door to day, table to exit, the span between what a father can acknowledge and what a daughter can bear. Old habits calm me. They also hurt. "Ma'am," Mark said, coming close enough to be private without making a secret of it. If you'll permit me, I'd like to speak with you in the side room when the room has its feet back under it. Yes, I said, because some conversations you earn by waiting, others by standing up at the right time. He nodded once, respect passing between us like a baton no one would drop. The bride squeezed my elbow as the DJ found a safe, old song and let it be a bridge. Thank you, Lacey whispered, though I hadn't moved. Her voice trembled, then steadied. I'm sorry. I shook my head just enough to say, not now, not here. We both knew the apology wasn't for the collapse. It was for the years that preceded the sentence that tipped the night. Glasses found water. The mayor, who would have loved to narrate, reconsidered the microphone as if it were an unsafe tool in untrained hands. Women with wheat stalk tattoos and men with seed company caps navigated the silence as though it were a wet floor. A toddler resumed stomping tomatoes on the dance floor, slower, careful, as if he'd learned gravity mid-spin. My father's gaze kept catching on me and sliding away, the way he sights a far fence post, squints, and waits for light to cooperate. He's built his life on straight lines and visible work, trucks without rust, boards that don't warp, rings that flash under fluorescent bulbs. I built mine on invisible work, checklists that keep people alive, quiet corrections that prevent bad stories, a palm steady enough that other hands don't tremble. He respects the kind of success you can point to. Tonight asked him to respect the kind you feel when the room doesn't break. The side room off the hall smelled like old chalk and chilly cook-off flyers. Fluorescent lights sang their insect hymn. Mark closed the door most of the way. Privacy, not secrecy. He didn't sit. Neither did I. Standing keeps language honest. When a room forgets its manners, he said, rank reminds it. That shouldn't have fallen to you tonight. I chose to carry it. His eyes moved to the faded county map on the wall, then back to me. I also owe you a different sort of apology, for naming rank at all. It can turn a life of service into a trump card. I used it like a level, not a hammer. Still. You used it clean, I said. If you were building a house, you'd show a board crooked and let the bubble tell the truth. You didn't shout at the lumber. He allowed himself half a smile. That was the aim. Also, there's gratitude I owe you, though we'll put details where they belong. In quiet. Years ago, after a storm, a certain nursing home evacuation crossed my desk in an after-action report. The language was plain and competent. Someone's calm was obvious in the lines between the lines. Tonight, I recognized it standing under a chandelier. I didn't ask whose son he meant. Some debts don't need names to be paid. Operations are teams, I said. Shelter is shared. He nodded and didn't push past what the moment would hold. Out there, he added, tilting his head toward the hall, is a man learning to hear himself without the static. I don't know if he'll choose the right sentence, but the room already changed shape. That matters. It does, I said. Rooms can learn. So can people. Sometimes they need a safer layout. We returned to the hall. A standard you can trust is like a good melody. People remember how to move to it. The child in patent leather shoes had fallen asleep in a chair, one white sock escaping a shoe like a flag of truce. The band chose a song even grandfathers knew. The gossip that could have bloomed found no oxygen. My mother lifted her chin toward me. My father looked up as if the ceiling had spoken. He held my eyes this time. No nod, no carpenter's smile, just attention, rare enough from him to feel like ceremony. If you're listening for anger, you might miss the older ache beneath it. I have spent years learning that a gate is not a wall. It is a promise. I stand where promises are tested. Tonight, under rented lights and the scent of cut flowers, the promise wasn't about credentials or ribbons. It was about whether a family would choose decency on purpose, whether a father could admit he'd measured with the wrong tool, whether a daughter would wield the right one without drawing blood. I counted the steps to the door again, 17, and chose not to take them. There would be time later for inventory. What was said, what was swallowed, what got repaired. For now, I stood still and let the room settle around the standard that had been set. Mark passed behind my chair and murmured, "Thank you for keeping it clean," a phrase only professionals need. I nodded without turning. Clean is not the same as easy. Clean is earned. Across the room, Lacey wiped a bit of frosting from a child's cheek. The groom adjusted a speaker so it wouldn't block egress. Small mercies, small corrections, right where they belonged. The chandelier threw its cold light again, but softer, as if it had learned too. This is the picture you carry forward. A man not injured so much as awakened. A bride who leads with her hands. A room that remembered its manners. A father at the table with a damp napkin on his brow and a new sentence forming slowly in a stubborn mouth. And me, measuring nothing but choosing to stay. If you want the map of how we arrived at this moment, why the joke cut where it did, why the salute mattered, why I counted exits even as I forgave the door, we will need to walk backwards through years of small, straight lines and the places they failed to meet. That's where the real story lives. And it did not begin tonight. I grew up on a road that ended in soybean fields, where the county fair was the biggest date on the calendar, and Friday night football doubled as proof of loyalty. My father knew every family on that road, and he measured them the way he measured boards for fences, by straightness, visible use, and whether they held in the weather. He had two categories for people, builders and everyone else. In his eyes, my younger sister Lacey was sunlight itself. She floated through cheer practice, her hair catching light the way blades catch wind. Boys wrote her notes folded like footballs, and she laughed as if the world had been tuned to her frequency. Teachers wrote "gifted socially" on her reports, and even when nobody knew what it meant, my parents smiled as if it were prophecy. I was steadier weather, unnoticed until it mattered. I kept lists taped above the washer, medication schedules, when mom had pneumonia, birthdays of uncles who claimed not to care, mileage on the mower. I found comfort in order, in charts that kept fear from spilling into the carpet. My father stood in the doorway with his cap in his hand once and said, "You don't need to turn this house into a hospital." He never understood that my charts weren't about medicine. They were about control in a world that could break at any hour. Mom tried to soften things. She'd pat my shoulder when I labeled chords or stocked the pantry with rows facing forward. But her gentleness rarely outweighed my father's silence. His nods went to Lacey's boyfriends, boys who lettered in sports or drove trucks with shiny rims. When one pitched a winning game, Dad tacked the program to the fridge like it was scripture. The week I passed a certification exam in emergency communications, my paper went in a drawer. "The refrigerator is for family," he said, closing the metal door with finality. Silence became the language between us. It wasn't cruelty, not the kind people mean when they shout or break things. It was colder, subtler. He believed the world fit into visible patterns. Acreage that could be priced at a glance, fences that stood straight, rings that caught the right kind of light. He wanted children who matched the pattern. One did, one didn't. At church potlucks, he placed me at the end of the table so you can pass plates faster, though really it was so I wouldn't disrupt the seating charts of men who talked about seed and weather. If a table rocked, I slid a sugar packet under a leg. If a spoon dropped, I wiped the handle and set it right. I thought it was virtue. It was habit. Fix what wobbles, keep the room steady. People chuckled that I had an old soul, while Dad said I was responsible like a mailbox. The words were meant as praise, I think, but the kind you give an object, not a person. The summer before graduation, I worked at the county fair gate, clipboard in hand, fluorescent vest catching headlights. Dad smirked when I came home. "There's your calling," he said. "Gate guard." The phrase stuck to me like burrs. What he didn't see was that I loved it. The flow of cars, the rhythm of scan, stamp, wave forward, it calmed me. I learned to spot arguments 30 yards out, to notice the grandmother who needed a chair before she asked. Once, when a storm blew, tents loose across the midway, I shouted for help and anchored canvas corners until we could save a lost boy from wandering into the storm. No medals, no headlines. Just breath, steadier than panic. Lacey came home from cheer practice with glitter still clinging to her cheeks. She'd ask me to sew buttons or quiz her on dances. "You're my rock," she'd say, and I wanted to believe it meant more than being her backstage crew. She dreamed of lake weekends, photos with perfect lighting, a life Dad could point to proudly. I dreamed of systems that worked when nobody noticed. By graduation, the pattern was clear. Lacey's boyfriend shouted her name from the bleachers with a homemade sign. Mom clapped until her knuckles whitened. Dad beamed like a man whose blueprints had been proved correct. When my name was called, Mom still clapped. But Dad's approval was a single nod, the kind he gave a straight fence post. No banners, no photos on the mantel. My folded program disappeared into the same drawer as my certificate. That drawer was not cruel. It was quiet. But quiet can bruise deeper than insults. Recruitment brochures began showing up in the mail, tucked between community college catalogs and grocery coupons. Most smiled too wide, their glossy pages promising glory that felt hollow. But one, the Marine Corps, spoke in language I recognized. Logistics, discipline, chain of command. It didn't talk about being admired. It talked about being counted on. I didn't tell anyone when I visited the recruiter. I went after a shift at the pharmacy where I stocked bandages by size and brand until the neat rows calmed me. The recruiter asked what I was good at. I told him I noticed things before they squeaked. Distances, names, the way crowds moved. He said, "There's a place for that." At dinner, I slid the brochure next to Dad's plate. He read it, tapped a photo of a sentry at a gate, and smirked. "There you go. Gate guard." He meant it as dismissal. I took it as prophecy. Mom wore her good sweater when I raised my right hand. She cried quietly, the way practical women do, when pride and fear share the same body. Lacey took pictures on my phone, her laughter shaking even as she whispered, "You'll still be you." Dad shook the recruiter's hand and told him, "Bring her back better than you found her." Later on the porch, he added, "People who sign up don't always come back. People who stay learn to mind their business." It was as close as he could come to love, packaged in warning. In those last weeks before I left, the town gave me a send-off in the VFW hall. Neighbors signed a card with one shared pen. Old veterans told me stories that didn't need correcting. One man leaned close and said, "Stand straight when it's easy, so you know how when it's not." I wrote it down that night in the notebook I kept hidden, a notebook that would become the spine of my life. The morning I left, the road out of town looked exactly like the road in. Dad didn't wave. He stood with his hand on the mailbox, steadying it against a wind that wasn't blowing. That's the image I carried, a man guarding a mailbox, waiting for a letter he might not read. I told myself I would come back different in the ways that mattered, and the same in the ways that counted. But part of me knew the straight lines of his world would never quite fit the crooked but purposeful paths of mine. And that was the root of the division that would one day break open under a chandelier. Paris Island smelled of metal and pine sap mixed with sweat, as if the air itself was in training. The bus door opened and the heat slapped us awake. Comfort wasn't the point. Obedience was. A drill instructor's voice split the night, stacking orders like bricks until our thoughts had no choice but to fall into line. I wasn't the fastest or strongest recruit. What I had was observation. I watched which girls burned too bright in week 1, wasting energy on sprints, and which saved their breath for the last mile. I noticed who taped their blisters in silence, and I learned their grandmother's name so I could remind them to drink before they fainted. Leadership, I discovered, was just ordinary kindness applied on time. Rifle week left my shoulders aching and my mouth tasting like copper. My first grouping sprayed wide like nervous weather. But repetition is a quiet form of courage, and by Friday, the bullets lived closer together. Consistency beats talent when talent wanders, the instructor said. I copied the line into the notebook I carried everywhere. Mail call was a lesson in silence. Some recruits received thick stacks of letters that smelled like home. I got 2. One from Mom with a cartoon heart, one from Lacey with jokes and a playlist, none from Dad. I wasn't surprised. I folded both into the notebook and made a rule: don't confuse silence with absence. Still, the absence hummed in me like a missing tooth. Graduation felt like standing inside a drum. The band punched the air, white gloves flashing. When we threw our covers and caught them again, Mom's face glowed like a lantern. Lacey screamed my name until her voice broke. Dad shook my hand and said only, "You finished what you started." Not a benediction, but not nothing. My first post was a gate. To civilians, that sounded small, like I'd trained for months just to check IDs. But a base is a promise. The gate is where you keep it. On my 3rd night, a contractor van pulled up with a decal slightly off-center. The driver smiled too much, paperwork listing a delivery long after hours. I waved him to secondary inspection and radioed my supervisor. Nothing illegal, just sloppy. And sloppy at the perimeter is how bad stories start. Good catch, the sergeant said. I shrugged. The checklist did the work. He shook his head. Checklists don't notice crooked decals. People do. Most nights passed without headlines, which is exactly what you want when families are sleeping under your watch. I learned the regulars by their taillights, memorized which colonels forgot paperwork twice a month, which young Marines covered fear with sharp jokes. I kept notes in my head, each detail another thread in the net that kept the base safe. A retired gunnery sergeant with Sunday donuts taught me to look at hands before eyes. Eyes lie, he said. Hands tell the plan. A corporal from Louisiana taught me to hear drunk before I smelled it. The sergeant of the guard taught me boredom was a risk. We quizzed each other in the last 5 minutes of every shift. Off duty, I took classes in communications and emergency management, dry subjects that built the scaffolding of safety. I wrote 2 letters a month, small stories for Mom and Lacey, larger truths for Dad. He replied once, comparing my seconds-long inspections to the pace of baling hay. Every second matters, he wrote. I saved it, even though the compliment was buried in pragmatism. Then came the storm. Hurricane season had been prowling the coast like a predator everyone pretended not to see. We sandbagged low doors, rehearsed moving families to the gymnasium that doubled as a shelter. When the power failed with a clean snap, the gym became a cavern of frightened breath. A toddler cried until I crouched and whispered, "This building has a superpower. It can hold a storm without spilling." She believed me, and then so did her mother. Afterward, we checked base housing. A woman with a busted porch light tried to hand me $20 for hauling limbs. "For whatever comes next," she said. I tucked the bill into my notebook, not to spend, but to remember that people try, even when they hand you the wrong thing. That hurricane etched something permanent in me. Calm is contagious. Panic spreads like fire, but steadiness is water. Promotion came in increments. A ribbon, a stripe, a line on an evaluation that said, "Calm under pressure." People think big moments build you, but it's the small ones. Fixing a badge printer at 1700 so the night passed quietly, double counting inventory so no Marine had to sleep hungry, listening at 0300 when someone admitted home didn't feel like rest. One supervisor pulled me aside after a long shift. "Ever think of the officer route?" he asked. "We need leaders who don't mistake volume for authority. You make people better without making them smaller." The idea scared me, but fear, I'd already learned, was often just a higher standard knocking on the door. So I stayed the course, one post at a time, one promise at a time. The gate was never glamorous, but it was clean, and clean was enough. What I didn't know then was that this habit, this steady insistence on keeping order, would follow me into rooms far more treacherous than checkpoints. One day it would follow me home, into a fellowship hall filled with laughter sharp enough to cut. Because gates aren't just metal and scanners. Gates live inside families too, and my family had been guarding the wrong things for years. By the time I reached my 2nd year, the rhythms of military life had become the pulse of my own. Boots polished, bun tight, uniform inspected with eyes harsher than any mirror. Yet what stayed with me most wasn't the shine, but the stillness. Those pauses between orders where you had to decide if you'd step forward or shrink back. I had learned to step forward. The gate taught me vigilance. But beyond that gate, I started learning about responsibility that carried weight. I signed for equipment worth more than my father's entire farm, crates that had to be accounted for down to the last serial number. A sergeant once tapped a manifest and said, "Check it like your name lives there." I did. And when one crate drifted off the list, I found it before drift became loss. Nobody clapped. That's the point. Quiet corrections save lives louder than medals. The officer route lingered in my thoughts like a dare. Nights I studied logistics under yellow lamplight. Lacey would text emojis, a string of hearts, a photo of her dorm friends, her grin framed by Christmas lights. She was thriving at a pace I couldn't match socially, but I had found my own language. Charts, maps, systems. Where she floated, I anchored. I began to notice things about myself I hadn't owned before. I wasn't just responsible like a mailbox, as my father once said. I was reliable like steel under pressure, invisible until the moment it was needed. And in the core, that had value. Field exercises made this clearer. Radios went dead in valleys maps called flat. Convoys faced bridges too weak to bear their weight. We solved problems on the fly, rerouting trucks, hand-drawing overlays in the mud, sending runners, because batteries can die, but legs usually don't. I learned how much of leadership is simply noticing the right problem at the right time before it collapses into catastrophe. The hurricane season made good on its promise again. We forward-staged supplies south of the predicted landfall, trusting data over rumor. The storm still chewed through coastal towns, flooding nursing homes, and schools turned into shelters. I was tasked with logistics, water, tarps, generators. A nurse handed me a list of patients, medications circled in shaky pen. The air inside that building was a held breath, and I knew if we miscalculated even one step, people wouldn't wake in the morning. We built a relay, Marines carrying EMTs through waist-high water, coaxing a pump like it was a stubborn friend, stabilizing an old corporal who once fixed engines but now trembled under weight. The building held. Every name on the nurse's paper was accounted for. Later, a state official arrived with a bullhorn, posing for a photo. I filed my after-action report quietly at midnight. Nobody clapped then either, but I slept knowing the storm hadn't stolen what it wanted most. It was around then that my reputation started to form, not through speeches or ceremony, but through whispers. She notices things. She steadies the room. She doesn't let things slide. It wasn't glamorous, but it was currency, and it bought me trust. I mailed a photo of myself in uniform to Mom. She placed it on the mantel until a cousin's baby announcement took its spot. Dad sent a text that said, "Collar looks heavy for July." That was his way of trying. He never said the word proud, but in his clipped practicality, I read a shadow of it. Lacey, meanwhile, flooded my phone with laughter in strings of GIFs and emojis, our private language unbothered by distance. One day at muster, I noticed a young Marine shaking in a way too contained to be ordinary, hands clenched just enough to betray the plan. Not okay. I walked him aside, asked about home in a low voice, let him breathe until the ground steadied. Later, his gunny slipped a coin on my desk and said, "For noticing." That coin still lives in the same zip bag as my notebook. The higher I rose, the more the notebook filled. Lessons written plain, truths borrowed from storms and gates alike. Consistency beats talent. Clean is enough. Make people larger, not smaller. These lines became my doctrine. Promotion came with heavier bars, but the weight wasn't the metal, it was people's trust. That trust I carried carefully. A careless leader could undo what 1,000 checklists preserved. And yet, even as my career built into something sturdier than my father imagined, his silence stayed the same. No letters, no banners on the fridge. Just a man who thought pride was weakness, withholding it as if rationing would make me tougher. I told myself I didn't need it. But some nights, staring at the ceiling after a 12-hour shift, I felt the absence heavier than any crate. Still, I moved forward, because gates only work when you stand your post, and I had chosen my gate. What I didn't realize was that the habits I built here, the noticing, the steadiness, the refusal to let silence define truth, would one day return to test me in the most personal room of all. A fellowship hall under a chandelier, my father's voice echoing, and an entire family forced to learn the cost of decency ignored. That night would come. But first, the Corps would teach me how to stand straighter than I ever had before. By the time I pinned on lieutenant's bars, storms no longer rattled me. They were forecasts to be tracked, logistics to be staged, people to be moved like chess pieces across soggy boards. Chaos didn't feel like chaos when you had a map, a team, and the discipline to trust both. But some storms carve themselves into you. It was late summer when the hurricane barreled in, the kind of wall of water and wind that makes television anchors shout in rain slickers. Our maps showed a nursing home in the projected path. Its backup generator was overdue for service, its evacuation plan more ink than action. Still, we rolled out. Trucks, tarps, deuce-and-a-halves, 2 ambulances, a handful of young Marines with eyes brighter than their experience. When we arrived, the building was already sagging against the storm. Windows moaned. Water pushed against doors like a thief testing locks. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered, and the air carried the sour tang of panic. Nurses held clipboards with shaking hands. An old woman in a cardigan buttoned wrong whispered that her husband used to drive the school bus. She clutched my sleeve, looking at me as though I could guarantee daylight. I moved without drama. Split the Marines into teams: stretcher carriers, supply runners, pump operators. No shouting, I told them. Calm as oxygen. A corporal with freckles repeated it under his breath like a prayer as he lifted a man who weighed almost as much as he did. The generator coughed once, then died, leaving the hallways darker than sin. Flashlights cut slices through the black, catching faces lined with fear. I felt the ground tilt under the weight of responsibility. It wasn't a battle against an enemy, it was a battle against time. Relay system, I ordered. Marines to EMTs, EMTs to trucks, trucks to higher ground. We formed a human chain in water up to our waists. Young men who had never known storms like this carried elders who whispered blessings into their collars. One Marine sang softly to steady an old man whose oxygen mask hissed like a dying snake. A pump groaned, threatening to quit. I knelt beside it, palms slick, coaxing it the way you'd coax a horse too tired to keep pulling. It sputtered back to life. A cheer tried to rise in the hallway, but I killed it with a look. Save your breath, I said. We're not done. Hours blurred. At some point, dawn broke pale and unspectacular, but we were still moving. Every name on the nurses' list was accounted for. Nobody lost. Not one. When it was over, the state official arrived in khakis too clean for the mud and posed with a bullhorn. Cameras flashed. He gave sound bites about resilience. I didn't step into the frame. Instead, I sat on a curb, uniform soaked, hands raw from ropes and stretchers, and wrote in my notebook, "Calm is shelter." That phrase became my compass. Later, one of the younger Marines, just 19, freckles still visible under streaks of dirt, found me. "Ma'am," he said, "I thought I was going to lose it back there. Then I saw you weren't moving fast, just steady. Made me think maybe I could be steady too." "You were," I told him. He shook his head. "No, you lent it to me." That moment, more than ribbons, more than ranks, settled something deep. Leadership isn't shouting the loudest. It's being calm enough that others borrow it. I wrote the after-action report plain and clean. No adjectives, just numbers, timelines, outcomes. But anyone who read it could see the through line: steadiness. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have guessed, was that someone else would one day read that report, that a man named Mark, years later, would stand at a wedding reception and recognize the same calm in the way I held still under a chandelier. Back then, though, it was just another storm survived, another night where checklists and choices kept lives intact. When I finally peeled off my boots, my feet were blistered, my body bone-heavy, but my mind was sharper than ever. I knew storms would come again. The question was never if. It was whether you'd be ready to stand straight when the wind tried to bend you. And I swore then, notebook open on my lap, that if calm was my gift, I would spend it recklessly on others, even if it cost me, even if it went unnoticed. Because calm, like gates, is a promise. And promises, once kept, become the kind of storms that never wash away. Storms receded, but their lessons stayed etched into me like grooves in steel. Promotions followed, incremental at first, a ribbon, a stripe, another bar pinned with ceremony and claps that felt polite but never necessary. Each step meant heavier responsibility, not heavier applause. I didn't need fireworks. I needed systems that held. By the time I wore captain's bars, I had learned the true currency of leadership, trust measured in the steadiness of other people's eyes. Marines looked at me, not because I shouted, but because I didn't. Calm became my signature. It carried through inventories, midnight drills, convoys rerouted at the last minute because some bridge had been mislabeled in a government binder. And yet with every success, my father's silence grew louder. Mom wrote faithfully. Long letters about bake sales, church dinners, small-town gossip stretched like taffy into paragraphs. Lacey sent photos of her life, her college dorm strung with fairy lights, later her engagement ring glittering in sun, then baby clothes folded on a nursery chair. Her text came with emojis that translated into pride without needing words. Dad rarely wrote. When he did, his sentences came sharp as fence posts. Looks heavy for July. Every second matters if you're baling hay. Not cruel, just practical to the point of absence. He rationed praise as though it were fuel too costly to waste. I told myself I didn't need it. I had medals, evaluations marked steady under pressure, Marines who carried my steadiness into their own lives. But some nights, when the base went quiet and the hum of a distant generator was the only sound, I admitted to myself that silence can bruise deeper than any insult. One evening, during a field exercise, I noticed a young Marine keeping his head too low, his hands trembling as he loaded gear. At muster, his smile looked forced, too tight, too rehearsed. I pulled him aside, spoke about nothing for 5 minutes until he admitted that going home felt like walking into enemy territory, parents who belittled him, a brother who made his life small. His words hit me with the force of recognition. I didn't tell him mine. I just walked him to the chaplain's office and made sure he wasn't left alone. Later, the company gunny dropped a coin on my desk. "For noticing," he said. It joined the others in the zip bag with my notebook, each coin a quiet reminder that small acts of steadiness can anchor more than you'll ever know. Still, even with these victories, I felt the tug of absence. Dad never saw me sign for equipment worth more than his farm. He never heard the sergeant say, "Ma'am, check the serials like your name lives there." He never read the after-action reports where my steadiness held hundreds safe. To him, my accomplishments were invisible, and part of me feared that invisibility meant they weren't real. Meanwhile, Lacey built her own world. She married a man who listened, who sent me photos of their daughter stacking blocks into small, proud towers. Their home glowed with warmth, laughter spilling out like sunlight under a door. I was proud of her, but sometimes the distance felt like a fault line. She had inherited the mantle of family approval, while I had inherited silence. I poured myself into work. At one installation, I noticed visitor lanes clogging every day at shift change. The badging office closed at 1600, while traffic peaked at 1630. It was just how things were. I charted the delays, shifted hours, stationed a sergeant at the choke point with authority to adjust lanes. 10 minutes of average delay disappeared overnight. No one clapped. But a corporal got to daycare on time. A family ate dinner together without hurry. That was enough. Yet even as systems ran smoother, I carried the knowledge that my father measured worth in visible boards, not invisible fixes. He loved the boys who lettered in baseball, the men who built straight fences. He respected those who could point to their work and say, "See?" and me. I carried systems, not boards. I carried coins in a zip bag, phrases in a notebook, Marines steadied by calm they borrowed from me. I carried silence that I never asked for, but never escaped. The higher I climbed, the heavier that silence grew, like a weight that no ribbon could balance. I told myself it didn't matter, that leadership wasn't about applause, it was about promises kept. But late at night, I wondered if I was lying. Because storms taught me calm is shelter. The Corps taught me consistency beats talent. But family, the place where I wanted calm to matter most, still hadn't learned. Not yet. By the time I wore a major's oak leaves, my life felt built on checklists and steady corridors of decisions. But promotions don't erase childhood fault lines. They just illuminate them when you return home. The invitation came in a cream envelope with silver script, Lacey's wedding. Caleb, her fiancé, ran a small electrical shop and coached JV basketball. He wore clean boots, looked people in the eye, and my father approved of him immediately. "Builder," Dad muttered once, as if the word itself belonged on a mantle. I hadn't been home in years. Duty had given me purpose, but distance had given me insulation. Now, returning meant stepping back into old patterns that had never bent in my favor. The weeks before the wedding unfolded like a logistical drill disguised as celebration. Mom fussed over linens and buttercream frosting, her voice tight with the weight of making everything perfect. Lacey was radiant, though even she snapped when stress pinched too hard. Dad loomed over details as if he were inspecting a fence line, chairs, tables, seating charts. It was the seating chart that first drew blood. Dad suggested I sit near the back so you won't feel trapped. The words stung because they carried truth. He knew I measured exits even in safe rooms, but then he added, "And so we don't make a deal of things." I swallowed my retort, told him I preferred the end of the table so I could pass plates faster. He took it as proof he'd been right. That was how our language worked. My attempts at dignity folded into his sense of order. Mom tried to smooth it. "It'll be fine," she said, tucking a stray hair behind my ear, but her reassurance was paper-thin. At the rehearsal dinner, the tension sharpened. We gathered at the VFW hall under flags that had seen more arguments than ceremonies. Neighbors told stories into a microphone that popped at the wrong consonants. Caleb's coach praised him as the kind of man who stays for cleanup. The mayor told a too long joke, and everyone clapped politely. Then Dad stood. His toast began with volume instead of grace. "Lacey's the beauty. Always was." He gestured toward me. "And this one, organized. Too broad, too general, but organized." Laughter hopped across the room, nervous, complicit. I smiled the way you smile when someone is trying, in the only language they have, but inside my chest tightened. Organized, as if my life's worth could be reduced to bullet points on a clipboard. And then, in the back corner, I noticed Caleb's father, Mark. He wore a suit that fit without trying, shoes polished without boasting. His handshake when we were introduced was clean, firm, but not dominating. He didn't bother with small talk. Instead, he asked how many chairs could fit in the fellowship hall without blocking egress. 216, I answered, if we keep aisles clear for evacuation. His nod was small, but satisfied. "You run on standards," he said. "So do I." He didn't say Marine, neither did I. We didn't exchange ranks, but respect moved between us like current. He asked where the first aid kit would be stationed, what the plan was, if lightning forced people inside. I answered, and his smile didn't show teeth, only approval. "Good," he said. "If the music stops, the night doesn't." We spoke for 6 minutes. 6 minutes where the noise of the room fell away, where I recognized something rare, another professional who understood that calm wasn't decoration. It was structure. Respect walks in on quiet feet. That night, I wrote a new line in my notebook. When standards recognize each other, silence becomes handshake enough. But my father's words lingered. Beauty for Lacey, organized for me. The difference between spotlight and shadow, applause and silence. I told myself it didn't matter, that tomorrow wasn't about me, that I would stand where useful, as always. Yet under those flags, with laughter still echoing, I felt the first fuse spark toward what would burn under the chandelier. The morning of the wedding dawned clear, the kind of sky that fools you into believing storms have forgotten your name. Mom pinned a brooch to my shoulder that once belonged to her mother. "For steadiness," she whispered. Lacey kissed my cheek, leaving lipstick on my jaw before wiping it away with trembling fingers. Dad checked his watch as if vows and love depended on second hands. At the church, the sanctuary smelled of flowers that had traveled farther than some of the guests. Ushers in borrowed jackets shifted nervously, waiting for cues. I found my seat near the back, not because Dad had suggested it, but because vantage points matter. From there, I could see exits, aisles, faces, old habits die hard. The ceremony unfolded simply. No jokes wilted in the air. No theatrics cracked the vows, just words clean enough to stand on. For a brief moment, I believed the day might stay steady. Then came the reception. The fellowship hall was strung with lights, the tables covered in linen that crinkled under fingertips. Sinatra drifted through the speakers. Children stomped invisible grapes on the dance floor. For a while it was good, almost ordinary, until Dad decided to speak. He leaned toward a cousin, voice pitched to Carrie. "She's just a gate guard. Who would invite her?" The words sliced through laughter like a blade. The cousin studied his plate, but others obeyed the oldest rule of nervous systems, follow the loudest voice. Laughter rose, uneasy, but complicit. My throat tightened. Across the room, Lacey froze by the cake, her hand trembling around a silver server. Then Mark stood. He set his glass down so gently the stem didn't rattle. He stepped forward, not rushing, each move precise, as if answering a roll call. The air shifted. Guests who had been laughing felt their spines straighten without meaning to. He raised his right hand in a salute that cracked like a flag in wind. "Sir, with respect," he said, his voice steady but sharp enough to cut. "She outranks every one of us here." The room snapped silent. A fork clattered, a child's spin halted mid-twirl. Laughter scattered like frightened birds. My father blinked, color draining from his face. He tried for a smile, failed. "Outranks," he muttered. She was a fairground guard with a clipboard. Mark didn't lower his hand until the salute had lived its full life. Then he dropped it, clean, and faced the room. "You're confusing a post with a person," he said evenly, "and a joke with judgment. A gate is where a community keeps its promise to itself, and she has kept that promise longer than most of you have noticed." No one moved. Not the mayor, not the banker, not the cousin still gripping his fork. The quiet was honest, the kind that arrives when a truth has finally found air. I felt myself caught between fury and gratitude. Fury that my father would still reduce me to a line-item insult. Gratitude that someone else had chosen to correct the record when I couldn't without detonating the room. My chest ached with the weight of both. Dad swayed, missed a chair, and hit the floor. Gasps scattered. The bride was first to move, her calmness cutting through panic. "He's breathing," she said. "Juice, fan." Guests scrambled to obey, glad for orders. I stayed still. Panic spreads when leaders rush. Calm steadies when leaders choose gravity. Mark's eyes flicked toward me. A small nod passed between us, professionals recognizing the other's post. And in that moment, under a chandelier and linen-draped tables, I understood. Respect isn't inherited. It isn't awarded at family tables or carved into mantles. It's earned in storms, in gates, in rooms where silence waits for someone to set it straight. That night, under the glare of cold light and the weight of old wounds, my father's words finally collapsed against a stronger truth. The room shifted, and none of us would leave unchanged. After the collapse, the fellowship hall moved in careful breaths, as though the walls themselves knew they'd just witnessed something too raw to name. Guests murmured. Water was fetched. Fans fluttered. Dad sat slumped in a chair now, a damp napkin pressed to his forehead, his pride leaking faster than his color. Mark approached me quietly, his presence steady, but not invasive. "If you'll permit," he said, "I'd like to speak with you before the night ends." His voice carried no pomp, no theatrics, just an offering. I nodded, and he returned to his place with the kind of grace only a man used to real stakes can hold. Later, when the band picked up a tune safe enough for even the most cautious to sway to, Mark touched my elbow and led me into a side room. Fluorescent lights buzzed. A map of the county hung crooked on the wall, pushpins marking casserole deliveries from some forgotten church drive. He didn't sit, and neither did I. "When a room forgets its manners," he said, "sometimes rank has to remind it. That shouldn't have fallen to you tonight, so I took it." His gaze held mine, not pitying, just plain. "But I owe you an apology for invoking rank at all. You don't carry it like a weapon. You carry it like a level, and tonight I risked making it into spectacle." "You didn't," I replied. "You kept the room from breaking." He gave the faintest smile. "That was the aim. And there's gratitude, too. Years ago, after a storm, I read an after-action report from a nursing home evacuation. Clean, steady, no adjectives. But the calm bled through the lines. My son was there. He came back different. Tonight, I saw the same calm standing under a chandelier. I know whose it was now." For a moment, words failed me. That storm had etched itself into my bones, but I never thought it had reached farther than the soaked uniforms and trembling hands that lived it. Knowing it had shaped someone else, that it had taught his son what shelter looks like, was a truth I hadn't expected to carry. "Operations are teams," I said finally. "Shelter is shared." Mark nodded. "Still, you lent him your steadiness. I needed you to know that debt was noticed." We didn't shake hands again. Some acknowledgments are too heavy for repetition. Back in the hall, the air had softened. The bride danced with her groom, her laughter finding its rhythm again. The gossip that would have bloomed found no oxygen. People straightened their spines, carried themselves with new caution. Respect had recalibrated the room. Dad sat at a corner table, a glass of water in his hand, his gaze moving between me and his lap. When I stepped closer, he startled as though caught in an old mistake. His mouth opened, closed, then found words clumsy but honest. "I thought the world was smaller than it is," he said, staring at the wet ring on the table. "I thought straight lines meant fences, boards, crops that don't bow. Turns out it also means other things I never learned how to measure." He swallowed hard. "I called you a gate guard like it was a joke. Forgot gates are where promises start. I didn't hear it. That's on me. I was wrong in front of people. And you were right, in ways that matter." His voice cracked. "Even if nobody clapped." "Dad," I said, the word itself a fragile bridge, Every post matters. The trick is remembering who we're guarding. His eyes lifted, wet but unblinking. I've been guarding the wrong thing. Pride is a flimsy fence. We didn't hug. Ours was never a hugging family. But he stood, and for the first time in years, we risked an awkward sort of dance. Two people circling around a new rhythm, finding the beat late, but realizing late is still on time. Before the night ended, he touched my arm and whispered like an oath, "I'll do better where I am." For him, that was an apology. For me, it was enough. Outside, sparklers burned in guests' hands as Lacey and Caleb left through a tunnel of light. The fellowship hall emptied into its honest state. Tables folded, lights clicked off with the neatness of someone thinking about electricity. I walked Dad to his truck under a sky so clean you could see the county's one bright star. He jingled his keys, but didn't start the engine. "You'll be back when you can," he said. "Bring your notebook. I've been doing the mail wrong for years." I smiled, the kind that comes after storms. "I'll show you a better system." That night, lying in my childhood bed with its old familiar dip, I wrote 2 lists. One titled Mailbox Repair, screws and hinges neatly bullet-pointed. The other titled What the Room Learned. 3 lines only. Truth needs manners. Respect isn't volume. Every post matters. If you came looking for revenge, you won't find it here. What happened under that chandelier wasn't punishment, it was correction. A father learned a straighter line. A family redefined success without mocking anyone else's map. We won't be perfect. He'll say the wrong thing again. So will I. But we've moved the fence line. We've put the gate where it belongs. At the start of our promises, not at the edge of our patience. And that, I've learned, is how families stay worth guarding.